So my name is Ramon Varcoe. I'm a vascular surgeon from Sydney, Australia. I'm currently based at the Prince of Wales Hospital and also at the University of New South Wales. So we performed a summary level meta-analysis looking specifically at patients with critical limb ischemia. It was in direct response to the meta-analysis published in 2018 by Dr. Katsanos and his colleagues, who looked at a slightly different group, a group with claudication. But in all other ways, we've replicated their meta-analysis. We looked at all-cause mortality, which has been linked to the use of Paclitaxel-coated devices. And we investigated that in patients after they received treatment with those Paclitaxel-coated devices. Well, it was a summary level meta-analysis. So we looked at all-cause mortality figures straight out of the manuscripts of published studies. These studies all had to have been published or accepted for publication. We did not include anything that had just simply been presented at Congress. And each of the studies had to have been a randomized controlled trial, treating on the one hand a group of patients who've been treated with a Paclitaxel-coated device versus those who've been treated with a more standard endovascular therapy. Each of the trials had to have had an intention to treat analysis design, and each of them had to have had at least 6 months of follow-up. In studies that didn't have at least 50% patients with critical limb ischemia, we approached the authors to try to tease out those patients who specifically had CLI so that we could be as true to this concept of a CLI cohort as possible. So across the board, whether you grouped all of the time points together or you separated all the time points out, we found no association between the use of a Paclitaxel-coated device and mortality, which was reassuring. Also, when we performed a sensitivity analysis looking at different doses of paclitaxel, looking at whether the treatment had been applied above or below the knee, and looking at long versus shorter lesions, we also found no association between paclitaxel use and mortality. It appeared to be safe in this group of patients. Well, I think given what we know about Paclitaxel-coated devices reducing the likelihood of a need for a target lesion revascularization, there is benefit to be had from these devices. And we just wanted to make sure there was no harm from the devices. And I think we've fairly conclusively demonstrated that there is no harm, unlike the claudicant meta-analysis that was performed back in 2018. I think there's always limitations to meta-analysis because it goes back to the studies you put inside the software algorithm. The first one I can think of is that our numbers were reasonably small, particularly at the longer time points. So there's a potential for us to be underpowered and perhaps introduce a type 2 error. There's also the fact that these patients with critical limb ischemia, they often have multi-system arterial disease. So some of them would have had paclitaxel devices in other vascular beds like the heart or the opposite leg. So that may well have biased our results to some extent. I think given that we know quite reliably that these devices can have beneficial clinical effects, because we haven't demonstrated any harm, they should be free to be used out there in the vascular community. Well, I think we should continue to add to this meta-analysis as more randomized controlled data comes along. So we should update it periodically as those trials come to hand. And perhaps we should consider doing a patient-level meta-analysis to really dive down deep into the sources of mortality to see whether there may be any obvious links or causes there that can be further extrapolated. Well, there is one point I'd like to make, and people often ask me this question. At around about the same time, another meta-analysis came out looking at a very similar thing by Dr. Katsanos, who'd done the original 2018 meta-analysis. And this one looked at patients with critical limb ischemia, just like we did, but it found different results. It found an association between the use of paclitaxel-coated balloons only and amputation-free survival, which is a slightly different endpoint. So people often ask me why the two meta-analyses found different things. And the first one is just the point that I've made, that the endpoints were different. We looked at all-cause mortality, just the same as the 2018 meta-analysis did, whereas this most recent Katsanos meta-analysis looked at amputation-free survival, which is generally considered to be an efficacy rather than a safety endpoint. Also, we had different inclusion criteria. We looked at all paclitaxel devices because we hypothesized that if paclitaxel was toxic, it didn't really matter how it was delivered, whether it be on a balloon or a stent. Whereas this most recent Katsanos meta-analysis looked at only drug-coated balloons, and they only looked at their application below the knee. Whereas again, we looked at applications both above and below the knee, thinking that if you're going to get paclitaxel and it's related to death, it should not really matter whether it was applied above or below the knee. But most importantly, the difference is that we included the Medtronic study, the Impact Deep trial, which published 5-year results and had presented them in the previous August at the AMP Symposium in Chicago. This was the second largest randomized controlled trial. It had the longest follow-up and it had the largest number of events with mortality numbers. So this was definitely the most influential of all the randomized controlled trials in our meta-analysis. But this one was overlooked by Katsanos and his team, and that made a big difference to the outcomes of the two meta-analyses.